The first thing I smelled was gasoline. It clung to the air in the courthouse hallway like an uninvited guest, faint but impossible to ignore. I didn't need to turn around and know she was behind me. Bryn Ashworth Sterling always announced herself without saying a word. Her perfume was sharp, expensive, and just sweet enough to mask the rot beneath it. She walked into my courtroom the way some people walk into their own birthday party, expecting applause. I was still wearing the same black robes I'd worn every day for 20 years. Still the Honorable Judge Miriam Blackwood, keeper of order and wielder of the gavel. But in that moment, the scent of fuel ghosting through my hair reminded me I was also a victim, a woman whose home had been reduced to ash 7 nights ago. And the woman responsible had just waltzed through my doors. Her heels clicked on the polished oak floor like a metronome. 1 step, 2 step, echoing down the aisle as though the entire room was a runway. The deputies stiffened but didn't stop her. They knew who she was. They just didn't yet know what she was. I did. The truth was buried in the charred remains of my front porch, in the scorched memorial garden where Harold's roses used to bloom. The fire marshal called it suspicious. I called it attempted murder. And I knew, without a shred of doubt, that Bryn had lit the match, if not with her own hands, then with the one she paid. She met my eyes from across the courtroom and smiled. Not the kind of smile you give a friend in passing, but the kind you see on a chess player who's already decided which piece to sacrifice for checkmate. That smile told me 2 things. She thought she'd won. She had no idea who she was dealing with. 6 months earlier, my life had been quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a funeral, when you move through days in the same clothes, reheating coffee you never drink. Harold's side of the bed still held the faint indentation of his shoulders. His book sat on a nightstand with a bookmark halfway through a history of the Supreme Court. Our home, a 1940s craftsman in Pinewood Estates, was full of little unfinished moments like that. I had just finished planting the fence posts we'd planned together during his last weeks. A 6-foot cedar barrier, straight as a gavel's edge, stained the color of strong tea. Harold had called it our wall against the world. I just thought of it as the one thing I could finish for him. That's when she appeared. The silver Tesla stopped at the curb like it owned the street. Out stepped Bryn, tall, polished, athletic in a way that suggested her gym sessions were as carefully curated as her Instagram feed. She had a tape measure in one manicured hand and a smoothie in the other. "You must be the widow," she said. Not as a question, not even with curiosity, just a label. "Judge Blackwood," I corrected, wiping cedar dust from my palms. Her smile twitched. "Right. Well, Judge, we have a little situation. HOA regulations cap fences at 6 feet exactly. Yours looks ambitious." The tape measure snapped open like a switchblade. She drew it across the top rail, lips pursed, as if she were measuring my worth along with the wood. 6 feet, I said before she could. 6'2", she replied, reading the numbers like a guilty verdict. "That's a $500 fine, plus removal." I didn't move. "Show me the bylaw." 5 minutes later, she was still shuffling through papers she'd brought for the occasion, producing nothing but irritation. Because the rule didn't exist. And she knew it. That was the first time I saw the look, the one that would return again and again. A look that said I had just been marked for something far larger than a fence dispute. The next week, the letters began. Each envelope bore the HOA seal in glossy ink, each message more absurd than the last. Unapproved memorial garden feature. Non-compliant mailbox color. Excessive bird feeding. The memorial garden was for Harold. The non-compliant mailbox had been there since Reagan's first term. The excessive bird feeding was one small feeder that attracted the Cardinals Harold loved to watch with his morning coffee. The fines ranged from $50 to $500. The threats escalated. Liens, forced removal, legal action. It would have been laughable if the intent wasn't so sharp. But I've been a judge long enough to recognize harassment dressed in legal stationery. That's when I started my own file. 3 binders color-coded. Fines, surveillance, witness statements. I documented everything. Dates, times, photographs from every angle. I'd handle drug lords and corporate embezzlers. An HOA president with a vendetta was just another case to prepare, except this one had walked right into my backyard. Then came the afternoon that burned away any thought this was just paperwork warfare. It was a Thursday. Court had run long. When I returned home, the gate to my backyard was wide open. Gavel was gone. The old tabby wasn't just a pet. He was the last living link to Harold. We'd found him in the courthouse parking lot during a thunderstorm 3 years before the cancer diagnosis. Gavel had stayed curled on Harold's lap through chemo sessions, purring like a metronome to keep time with Harold's heartbeat. I searched until my voice broke. Neighbors joined. The Rodriguez family, who'd already been driven from Pinewood by Bryn's harassment, came back just to help. We found him 3 days later, barely breathing in a veterinary oxygen tent. Broken ribs. Dehydration. The vet said he'd been chased by machinery, likely leaf blowers, maybe worse. My security cameras told the rest. Bryn had entered my yard that morning under the guise of inspection. An hour later, her landscaping crew showed up. Gavel, spooked by the open gate, bolted. They chased him 2 blocks before he disappeared into a storm drain. The footage turned my grief into something colder. This wasn't neighborly tension. This was a targeted campaign, and it had just crossed into criminal territory. Standing in my courtroom months later, staring at Bryn in her tailored blazer, I realized something. She thought she'd cornered me, that the fire, the fear, the humiliation were my undoing. She believed this was her arena now, but I'd spent my life in arenas like this. I wrote the rules. I knew the angles, and I was about to turn the game she'd started into the last one she'd ever play. The morning after Bryn's grand courtroom entrance, I woke to the metallic taste of last night's bourbon and the faint scratch of claws against my bedroom door. Gavel had learned to paw at it instead of yowling when he wanted breakfast. A survivor's adaptation, the vet called it, noise meant predators. He'd returned to me alive, but not unchanged. Now, every sound from the street set his ears twitching, his gaze tracking the shadows like a war veteran who couldn't stop scanning the horizon. I understood that too well. My own horizons had shifted since Harold died. Back then, my life had been measured in hearings, rulings, and the steady rhythm of coming home to someone who made the silence comfortable. Now it was measured in envelopes slid under my door, anonymous phone calls that hung up when I answered, and the slow, constant pressure of Bryn's presence in every corner of Pinewood Estates. The HOA newsletter landed in my mailbox that morning, glossy and smug. Bryn's president's note took up the front page, all talk of elevating standards and protecting property values. In between the lines, I could hear her real message. We decide who belongs here. I poured coffee, set the newsletter on the counter, and flipped through the stack of certified letters waiting beside it. Violation number 14. Lawn irregularity. Patchiness disrupting uniform street view. Violation number 15. Unregistered decorative lighting. Safety hazard. Violation number 16. Potential non-conforming structure. Backyard shed. All of them fabricated. All of them signed by Bryn in looping blue ink like a signature on a piece of art. I had binders for them now, color tabs, cross-references to the non-existent bylaws, photographic evidence disproving each claim. But the binders weren't what kept me steady. It was the people who'd started showing up at my door. It started with Walt Henderson. Walt had lived in Pinewood since the late 60s, the kind of neighbor who still brought over tomatoes in paper bags and fixed squeaky gates without being asked. He stood on my porch that evening in a wool sweater that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, his cap clutched in both hands. "Judge, I've seen her type before," he said without preamble. "Not in a courtroom. Out here. They don't stop unless you make them." He told me about the Rodriguez family's forced move over a garden statue, about a single mother fined into selling her house because her kids drew chalk rainbows on their driveway, about Mrs. Morgan's memorial garden for her late husband, ordered dismantled. Walt wasn't just venting. He was warning me. "This isn't about you breaking rules," he said. "It's about her deciding who gets to live here." That night, I added a 4th binder, community victims. Walt came back the next day with more names, more stories. Others followed, quiet knocks on my door at dusk, people slipping manila envelopes into my mailbox with photographs, letters, HOA notices identical to mine. The pattern was undeniable. Bryn's targets weren't random. They were chosen. Minorities, widows, single parents, retirees on fixed incomes. Anyone she thought couldn't fight back. Anyone but me. The first shift came with a phone call from someone I hadn't seen in years. Judge Blackwood. The voice was crisp, professional, carrying the kind of confidence you didn't fake. This is Patricia Donnelly. We met during the Walters case, 2008. But Donnelly, retired FBI, Financial Crimes Division. She'd testified in my courtroom more than once, a methodical witness with eyes that seemed to catalog every movement. I hear you've got yourself an HOA problem, she said. I didn't ask how she knew. People like Pat never called without already having a file in hand. I've been tracking her, Pat continued. Not just here. Arizona, California, Michigan. Same pattern every time. Takes over an HOA, starts bleeding the budget dry, uses harassment to push out the people who might notice. I gripped the phone harder. You have proof. I have a start. But you need to understand, this isn't petty. This is organized crime in yoga pants. Her words sank into me like cold water. It wasn't the first time I'd heard that kind of assessment about a criminal. It was the first time someone had applied it to my neighbor. 2 days later, Pat was sitting at my kitchen table, spreading photographs across the wood grain like a blackjack dealer laying out a winning hand. Bethany Sterling, Phoenix, 2019. Insurance payout for electrical fire. Rebecca Ashworth, Sacramento, 2015. Embezzled HOA reserves, vanished before the audit. Sandra Mitchell, Detroit, 2010. Federal prisoner for fraud, released, disappears. Every photo was Bryn. Different hair, different city, same predatory smile. She's a chameleon, Pat said. And Pinewood is just her latest terrarium. We talked for hours. About bank records that didn't match public budgets. About insurance policies inflated beyond reason. About preliminary claims she'd already filed for anticipated fire damage to her property before the first spark ever touched mine. Pat had a theory and the evidence to back it. Bryn wasn't just making my life hell for sport. She was staging me as the centerpiece of her next payout. Burn down my house, claim it spread to hers, collect millions. I thought about the smell of gasoline in my courtroom. The more we dug, the more the unease in Pinewood shifted into something sharper. Walt organized a network, neighbors watching from windows, jotting license plates, photographing any crew Bryn brought in. And Bryn noticed. Her letters came more frequently now, her inspections more brazen. One afternoon, while I was in court, my cameras caught her inside my backyard again, tape measure in one hand, phone in the other, photographing my shed from angles that made it look like it was falling apart. When I confronted her the next morning, she didn't even deny it. Just keeping our neighborhood safe, she said with a smile that never touched her eyes. Safe from what? I wondered as Gavel curled tighter into my lap that night, his ears flicking toward the sound of a car slowing outside. By the end of the month, I had over 200 pages of documented harassment, plus Pat's growing evidence of large-scale fraud. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Bryn was careful. No direct threats in writing. No obvious falsifications she couldn't wave off as clerical error. She played her role perfectly. HOA president, concerned neighbor, civic do-gooder. It was the gaps in her mask that told the truth. Like the day she knocked on Mrs. Morgan's door with a clipboard, demanding entry for safety inspection, only to freeze when she saw Walt leaning on his cane across the street, phone in hand. Or the time she arrived at the community meeting wearing a necklace I'd seen in an evidence photo from her Sacramento identity. Little tells, little cracks. I'd spent 2 decades watching people on witness stands, waiting for the moment they gave themselves away. Bryn had just begun, and I wasn't the only one watching anymore. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day so ordinary you'd never guess it would end with my hands shaking over a flash drive full of felonies. The morning had started with rain, a slow, cold drizzle that made the cedar fence glisten. Gavel watched from the windowsill, his tail flicking at the sight of cardinals darting between the branches. I planned to spend the day in court, then come home and review the latest batch of HOA notices for discrepancies. But by the time I stepped out of chambers at noon, My phone was vibrating with messages from half the neighborhood. Walt, Judge, you need to see this. Now, Mrs. Rodriguez. She's on your property. Unknown number. Call me. She brought a crew. I pulled up my security app before I even reached the elevator. The live feed nearly stopped my breath. Bryn was in my backyard again. But this time, she hadn't come alone. 3 men in matching dark coveralls moved with a precision I recognized instantly. I'd seen it in courtroom footage of organized crews setting up for insurance fires. One rolled out a hose of what looked like lawn treatment, but wasn't. The nozzle sprayed a thin, shimmering layer over the soil near my kitchen wall. Another was unpacking metal canisters from a crate stenciled with the name of a landscaping supplier that, according to my quick search, didn't exist. And Bryn, she was directing them like a general before a battle. By the time I reached Pinewood, the crew was gone. Bryn's silver Tesla sat smugly in my driveway, blocking my garage. She was leaning against the hood, arms crossed, looking as if she were supervising the weather itself. "Afternoon, Judge," she said, her voice all saccharine politeness. "Just conducting a safety review." I didn't bother to answer. Instead, I walked past her and unlocked my front door. The smell hit first, faint but unmistakable. Accelerant. It clung to the baseboards, the soil by the back steps, the air vents. "Whatever you're doing," I said, turning back to her, "you should understand something. You've already lost." Her smile deepened, like I'd just given her the line she was waiting for. "We'll see." That night, Pat and I watched the footage together at my kitchen table. She didn't speak until the last frame ended, Bryn leaning down to press her hand against my back gate latch, leaving it open as she walked away. Pat leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "This isn't harassment anymore. This is staging." "Staging what?" I asked, though I already knew. "A fire. And maybe more. The way they layered the accelerant? That's designed for directional burn. They weren't just prepping for property damage. They were prepping for a casualty." "You." The words didn't make me flinch. Not outwardly. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, focused clarity, the kind that comes when you've spent decades hearing lies and finally see the shape of the truth. "This is the point where you decide," Pat said, her voice low. "Do you want to keep documenting? Or do you want to dismantle her?" The decision was made before she finished asking. I've been careful until now, collecting, cross-referencing, waiting for the kind of evidence that leaves no air for a defense to breathe. But Bryn had crossed into the territory where waiting meant giving her another opening. The next morning, I filed 3 separate complaints. Unlawful entry, attempted property damage, animal cruelty, referencing the earlier incident with Gavel. I also made a call to someone I hadn't spoken to since Harold's funeral, Rebecca Morgan, a former federal prosecutor with a reputation for reducing white-collar criminals to begging in record time. "You finally ready to ruin someone?" she asked when I explained. "Yes," I said, "and I want it permanent." The escalation didn't take long to provoke a reaction. 2 days later, as I was leaving the courthouse, a black SUV pulled alongside the curb. The window rolled down, and Bryn's voice cut through the traffic noise. "You think you've got the upper hand because you wear the robe," she said, her smile absent now. "But I own this neighborhood, and people who go against me, they lose more than houses." I didn't break stride. "Then I guess you'll find out what happens when you try to burn down a judge's home." Her eyes narrowed, and for the first time, I saw something under the arrogance, calculations slipping toward desperation. That night, the twist came. I was reviewing HOA meeting minutes on my laptop when an email arrived from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was just 2 words, "Ask Walt." Inside was a single attachment, a scan of an insurance claim filed 3 weeks ago by Bryn, listing anticipated structural damage due to neighboring property hazard. The claim's timestamp was the day before she brought her crew into my yard. I called Walt immediately. His voice was gravel and regret. "I didn't want to drag you into this deeper," he said. "But if she's got that in writing, you need to know the rest. She's been pulling money out of the HOA's emergency fund for months. Transfers to accounts nobody can trace. And she's telling people your house is a fire trap, that when it goes, it'll take hers with it. When not if." It wasn't just a fraud case anymore. It wasn't just about me. Bryn was moving pieces on a board I hadn't even seen fully until now, positioning herself for a payout that would leave the rest of Pinewood in ruins. Pat's voice echoed in my mind. This is organized crime in yoga pants. I shut my laptop, feeling the weight of the moment settle in my chest. This was the midpoint, the line between documenting a bully and prosecuting a predator. Bryn had made her move. It was time for mine. The first frost of winter crept in overnight, whitening the lawn and turning the cedar fence into a silver outline against the morning sky. From my kitchen window, I could see Gavel curled into a tight ball in his bed, the slow rise and fall of his breathing proof that at least one thing in my life was still safe. For now, Rebecca Morgan arrived just after sunrise, her boots crunching across the frozen driveway. She carried 2 briefcases and the kind of expression I'd only seen on her before a federal takedown. "Morning, Judge," she said, stepping inside without ceremony. "I've read every file you sent. We're past the point of playing defense." Pat was already at the table, her own folders stacked neatly beside a thermos of coffee. Walt sat at the far end, flipping through a yellow legal pad, the paper worn soft from his constant rereading of names and dates. "This is what we're going to do," Rebecca began, sliding a sheet of paper toward me. At the top, in bold letters, 3-pronged offensive. Financial chokehold. Freeze HOA accounts through emergency injunction, citing misappropriation of funds and fraud indicators. Civil rights complaint. File with the Colorado Attorney General, naming Bryn personally for discriminatory targeting of residents. Criminal escalation. Deliver the accelerant footage and pre-filed insurance claim to federal prosecutors. "This isn't about waiting for her to make another mistake," Rebecca said. "It's about taking every move she's already made and using it to corner her until the only way out is a plea deal she'll never take." The financial chokehold came first. By noon, Rebecca had a judge's signature on an order freezing every HOA account, including the one Bryn had been siphoning for months. The effect was immediate. Bryn couldn't pay her crews, couldn't issue fines, couldn't even process the landscaping contracts she used to launder the stolen money. That night, Pat's surveillance team caught her pacing in her driveway. Phone pressed to her ear, her voice raised enough to be picked up from half a block away. "I don't care what it costs. Give me liquid cash now," she snapped. "We're not stopping." Her arrogance was cracking. But a corner predator is dangerous, and Bryn's response came faster than I'd expected. 3 days later, I found a manila envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a single photograph, me leaving the courthouse, my head turned toward someone off camera. Written across the bottom in red ink, "Tick-tock." Rebecca studied it without touching. "She's pushing intimidation now." "That's good." "Good?" I asked. "It means she's running out of legitimate tools. The moment she crosses into overt threats, the case for pretrial detention gets airtight." We met that evening in Walt's living room, the blinds drawn, the space thick with the scent of his pipe tobacco and the weight of what we were planning. "Here's the thing," Pat said, tapping a map of Pinewood Estates spread across the coffee table. "She's not just prepping your place. I've got signs of accelerant storage here." She pointed to a shed behind Bryn's property, and here, another marked 3 streets over, belonging to an elderly couple who'd been fined and in near bankruptcy. Walt leaned forward, his voice low. "She's going to burn the whole neighborhood if she thinks it'll cover her tracks." The idea landed in my gut like a stone. I've been focused on defending my own house, my own life. But the thought of those families, people who had come to me quietly with their envelopes and their stories, made my pulse quicken. "We don't just need to stop her," I said. "We need to catch her in the act." The trap took days to set. Pat coordinated with a friend still active in the FBI, arranging for discreet surveillance warrants. Walt organized a neighborhood watch so subtle it looked like normal evening strolls and casual porch sitting. Rebecca had federal prosecutors on standby with a sealed indictment, ready to file the moment we had the final piece of proof. And me? I did what I've always done best. I waited. Not passively. No, this was judicial waiting, the kind where every hour is spent tightening the net until the only choice left for the defendant is to walk right into it. The waiting was the hardest part. At night, when the house was quiet and Gavel was curled beside me, my mind kept replaying Harold's voice in the last weeks of his life. You've always been the patient one, Miriam. You know when to move. You just have to trust it. I trusted it. But there were moments, looking at the empty space where our memorial garden used to be, hearing the faint echo of Bryn's heels on the courtroom floor, when patience felt like cowardice. That's what she wanted, to wear me down until the fight didn't feel worth it. But that fight wasn't mine alone anymore. The final push came from an unlikely source. One of Bryn's own board members, a man named Carl who had mostly kept his head down during her reign, showed up on my doorstep after dark. His hand shook as he handed me a flash drive. "I'm done," he said simply. "I'm not going to prison for her." On the drive were internal emails between Bryn and her contractors, detailing the schedule for what they called Operation Renewal. It wasn't even subtle. They discussed ignition points, accidental equipment malfunctions, and how insurance adjusters could be manipulated to approve maximum payouts. My name appeared 3 times, each time alongside the word primary ignition source. Rebecca's eyes lit up when she read it. "This is it. This is your murder conspiracy charge. She can't talk her way out of this." We scheduled the move for the end of the week. The surveillance team would monitor Bryn's property, the neighborhood watch would keep eyes on the streets, and Rebecca's office would file the charges as soon as we had real-time evidence of her initiating the plan. But the night before, I stood in my kitchen staring out at the frost-covered yard, wondering if we'd made a mistake. What if she sensed the trap? What if she lit the match before we were ready? Gavel patted in and brushed against my leg, and I crouched to scratch behind his ears. His purr was soft, steady, a reminder that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about protection. For him, for Harold's memory, for every neighbor who had been too afraid to fight back. By morning, I knew. We weren't just preparing for a prosecution. We were preparing for war. The night we set the trap, Pinewood Estates looked asleep. Porch lights glowed dimly, curtains drawn tight. The frost on the lawns reflected the half-moon like broken glass. I sat in my darkened living room, the hum of the upgraded security system filling the silence. Gavel was upstairs in the safest room of the house, a windowless storage space turned feline fortress. Every channel of the monitor flickered with a different angle. My backyard, the street, the side gate, Bryn's driveway, 2 houses over. Pat's voice crackled in my earpiece from the unmarked van parked at the end of the block. Movement on her property. She's outside. The camera feed caught her stepping into view. She wore a fitted black coat, gloves, and an expression I'd only seen once before, the day she measured my fence like she was reading my sentence. 2 men followed, carrying equipment in cases the size of small coffins. Rebecca's voice joined the line. She was with federal agents in a staging area a mile away, waiting for my call. "They start planting accelerants. We move," she said. At 2:12 a.m., the first hose of liquid snaked across my side lawn. Under the infrared, it shimmered like spilled mercury. One man crouched to set a canister by the back steps, its nozzle aimed toward the vent near my kitchen wall. Pat's voice was steady but urgent. "They're building directional burn paths again. This is it." Bryn circled the crew, phone in hand, taking photographs of my hazardous conditions. The audacity was biblical, standing over her own crime scene as if she were gathering evidence for a neighbor dispute. I watched her pause by the fence, gloved fingers brushing the cedar. She glanced toward the camera, not like she'd spotted it, but like she was looking straight at me through it. Then she mouthed a single word. "Soon." That was the signal. I dialed Rebecca. "They've started. Move now." Within 3 minutes, headlights flared at both ends of the street. Black SUVs rolled in, silent but fast, their tires crunching over frost. Federal agents spilled out, weapons drawn, their breath steaming in the cold. The crew didn't even have time to run. One man dropped his canister and raised his hands. The other froze mid-step, still holding a length of accelerant hose. But Bryn tried to talk. "Officers, you're making a mistake," she called, stepping forward like she was welcoming them to her home. "I'm documenting a dangerous code violation. This woman's property is..." An agent cut her off. "Ma'am, drop the phone and keep your hand where I can see them." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes shifted, calculating escape routes that didn't exist. I stepped outside then, my boots cracking the frost, my robe pulled tight against the cold. The agents parted from me without being asked. "Evening, Bryn," I said. She turned toward me, and for the first time since I'd met her, there was no mask. Just a flash of raw fury. "This is harassment, and you know it." "No," I said. "This is justice." One of the agents read her the charges as the cuffs clicked shut. Conspiracy to commit arson, attempted murder, wire fraud, mail fraud, civil rights violations, RICO, conspiracy. The list kept going. Each word a nail in the coffin she'd built with her own arrogance. The real moment, the one I'll carry with me, came as they walked her toward the SUVs. She twisted in the grip of the agent holding her and spat the words like they were acid. "You'll never prove I meant to kill you." Rebecca's voice came from behind me, cold and certain. "We don't have to prove it. You already did." Bryn froze, confusion flashing across her face. That's when I saw the agent's hand over a tablet, the screen playing the final piece of our evidence. The email from Operation Renewal, her name beside the words primary ignition source, her time-stamped insurance claim filed weeks before tonight. Her jaw clenched. She didn't speak again. The neighborhood had gathered by then, drawn by the lights and movement. Walt stood on his porch, arms folded. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched a blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on Bryn with a mix of grief and triumph. When the SUVs finally pulled away, the street was silent except for the faint crunch of agents dismantling the accelerant canisters. Pat came up beside me, her breath fogging in the cold. "You okay?" I looked at the frost-mapped lawn, at the still wet paths where the accelerant had been laid, at the place where Harold's Memorial Garden used to be before Bryn tried to turn it into her excuse for murder. "No," I said, "but I will be." Inside, the warmth felt wrong after the cold outside. I sat at the kitchen table and poured a drink I didn't touch. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving space for the reality that I'd just watched someone try and fail to kill me in my own backyard. Upstairs, gavel meowed softly, a reminder that the danger had passed for now. I went to him, sat on the floor, and let him curl into my lap. His purr was louder than usual, steady and unbroken. It felt like the first breath I'd taken in months. At 4:47 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. "Charges filed. She's not getting out." I stared at it for a long moment, then typed back, "Good. Let's finish it." Because tonight had been the climax of her arrogance. But the real end, the one that would ensure she could never do this to anyone again, was still to come. And I would be there, gavel in hand, when the verdict fell. 7 months later, I walked into a courtroom that wasn't mine. Not as a judge, not as a plaintiff, but as a witness. The trial was federal, the kind reserved for people who didn't just break laws. They rewrote them for their own profit. The seal of the United States loomed over the bench, the eagle's wings stretching wide above the judge's head. Bryn sat at the defense table in a shapeless gray suit that had been pressed into stiff obedience by prison laundry. Her hair was dull, her hands bare jewelry. She looked smaller than I remembered, but the eyes were the same, calculating, restless, searching for the leverage she no longer had. 17 families from Pinewood filled the gallery, their faces a mosaic of closure and grief. Walt was there, flanked by the Rodriguezes. Mrs. Morgan clutched a photo of her late husband's memorial garden. The prosecutor's case unfolded like a slow, merciless tide. Financial records, surveillance footage, the email naming me as primary ignition source, and, finally, the accelerant patterns photographed under forensic light, each one a map of premeditated destruction. When my turn came, I swore the oath and told the truth, not just about the fire or the threats or the harassment, but about the way Bryn had tried to hollow out a community from the inside, how she'd turned neighbors into suspects and quiet streets into war zones. When I stepped down, I didn't look at her. The jury was out for less than 5 hours. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit arson, attempted murder, wire fraud, mail fraud, civil rights violations, and RICO conspiracy. The judge sentenced her to life without parole. Her co-defendants, the crew, her husband, her accountant, received terms that would keep them behind bars until they were names on a registry, not threats in the world. As the marshal led Bryn from the courtroom, she turned her head just enough to find me in the gallery. No words, no smirk, just a long, unblinking stare. It wasn't triumph I felt then. It was finality, the way a door sounds when it clicks shut for the last time. In Pinewood, the air felt different after the sentencing. Lighter. The HOA was rebuilt from the ground up. Walt was unanimously elected president, and bylaws were rewritten to prevent any one person from holding unchecked power. Every fine over $50 now required a community vote. Monthly financial statements went online. And, most importantly, discrimination based on age, ethnicity, or income was explicitly banned, with automatic removal for any board member who violated it. Neighbors who had once barely spoken now stopped each other on sidewalks to share updates about their gardens, their kids, their lives. The Rodriguez family moved back into a house just 3 streets over. Mrs. Morgan replanted her memorial garden, her husband's name carved into a stone that no one could ever order her to remove again. My house was rebuilt, not identical to the old one, but close enough that Harold's spirit didn't feel misplaced. The memorial garden bloomed again, richer this time, fed by soil Walt had tended while I was in court. Gavel patrolled the fence line every morning like he was the neighborhood's unofficial sheriff, his tail high and confident again. One evening, just before sunset, I stood at the edge of the garden with a mug of coffee. The light caught the roses in a way that made them glow, every petal a small act of defiance against what had been done here. Pat joined me, hands deep in her jacket pockets. You know, she said, this case is going to end up in training manuals. Not many people would have had the patience to dismantle her the way you did. I smiled faintly. Patience wasn't the hard part. What was? Remembering that this wasn't just about me. That if I made it personal, I'd miss the bigger picture. Pat nodded. You didn't miss it. The bigger picture kept expanding. Word of the case spread beyond Pinewood. Lawmakers in Colorado introduced legislation, the Pinewood Protection Act, requiring HOAs to publish financial records, limiting their power to fine without due process, and establishing state oversight for neighborhoods with repeated complaints. Within 2 years, 15 other states passed similar laws. Community groups formed, modeled after the network we'd built here, helping residents in other towns stand up to predatory boards. More than 40 copycat criminals were caught using those methods. Sometimes I spoke at their gatherings. I tell them the same thing every time. Document everything. Organize your neighbors. And remember, the law is only as strong as the people willing to use it. There are moments when I miss the anonymity of my old life, the quiet rhythm of judging cases that didn't spill over my own fence line. But those moments were rare. More often, I felt a deep, grounded gratitude that Pinewood had survived, that Harold's roses were blooming again, that the people who'd been driven out were coming home. The night before the first annual Pinewood Justice Festival, Walt's idea, of course, I sat on the back steps with Gavel in my lap. Music drifted faintly from the town square, where volunteers were setting up. Somewhere down the street, kids were drawing chalk rainbows on the sidewalk. For a long time, I just listened to the sound of my neighborhood breathing. Bryn would never hear it. She'd spend the rest of her days in a concrete box, her world reduced to cinder-block walls and the slow decay of time. There was no satisfaction in imagining her there, only the knowledge that she could never set foot in another neighborhood, never draw another map of accelerant paths, never stand in anyone's backyard and plan their destruction. Justice, in the end, wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting everyone else. On the morning of the festival, I opened my front gate and stepped into the street. Vendors lined the block, the air rich with the scent of barbecues and fried dough. Walt's Bluegrass Band was tuning up on the main stage. Pat was setting up a booth labeled Community Crime, Watch 101. Mrs. Morgan caught sight of me and waved me over to see the roses she'd brought from her garden to share. The Rodriguezes were handing out lemonade, and children ran in every direction, chalk dust on their fingers, their laughter rising above the music. For the first time in a long while, I felt the kind of peace that doesn't ask you to forget, only to believe that the worst is behind you. I went home that evening to find the last of the sunset spilling gold across the cedar fence. Gavel leapt up beside me, his eyes following the cardinals darting between Harold's roses. "This is still ours," I said aloud, my voice quiet but certain. And in the stillness that followed, I knew it always would be.